It's kind of an interesting scenario. I mean, X-Men and X2 were by no means masterpieces, but I think they set a pretty good standard for comic book films until the third and Origins came out. You would think after all these years, fans like myself would have gotten over X-Men The Last Stand by now, but apparently not. We have to delve deep at least one more time, at least for me to get over it. So, I'm Mod, and this is Sequality.
Well, to be perfectly fair, not everyone enjoys them. Some consider them average or mediocre. I admire them for sticking to the most important aspect of the source material, you know, the subtext of real-life prejudice and discrimination.
People like this Jean Grey. If it were up to me, I'd lock them all away. It's a war. It's the reason people like me exist.
But the point is, they treated themselves as films first, adaptations second, which is what I prefer, and treated their narratives with respectable pacing and progression. X-Men was pretty impressive for a first-ditch effort. It had depth, it was able to introduce some essential X-Men as well as the Brotherhood without the narrative becoming too cluttered. It touched upon the subtext that I mentioned earlier while still remaining what was essentially a good action film, and remained relatively faithful to most of the characters.
Scott.
It's not a great film, but it's not bad either, and I actually think it holds up better than the first Spider-Man. X2 was great. It was action-packed, the stakes were higher, the themes were great, the villain was great. The Wolverine and Deathstrike fight is probably one of my favorite superhero film scuffles to date. The characters set up from the first film are now far more fleshed out, and it promised something enormous for the third installment. It was subtly woven, but thematically intense. It remains one of my favorite comic book movies. X3 took that and threw it out the fucking window. X-Men The Last Stand is just an embarrassment. It was made by a barely competent director and had a script that couldn't decide what it wanted to focus on. The pacing is hasty, the characters are misrepresented, and the tack towards the subtext previously is now taken out in favor of contrived action sequences and embarrassing lines of dialogue.
I know the smell of your adamantium from a mile away.
Before Bryan Singer left the project, the film's story was going to touch upon a conflict between not only the X-Men and the Brotherhood, but also the Hellfire Club as to who would control the Dark Phoenix. Much like the Dark Phoenix saga from the comics and the 90s TV show. Instead, Dark Phoenix is reduced to a subplot and the real focus is on the mutant cure, which was not needed, nor wanted. I hate to sound like I'm picking on him, but the end result of X-Men 3 is in part Singer's fault. He sank two ships at once by leaving X3 to its ultimate fate and then went and made Superman Returns, which very few hold in positive regard. With David Hayter also gone from the writing team, X-Men 3 ends up feeling so different from its predecessors in terms of its storytelling, almost as if it has little to no connection to them, despite the narrative and returning cast.
Let's talk about that pacing, shall we?
Right from the get-go, the film felt off to me. When I had seen the film years ago, I couldn't really put my finger on it. And no, it's not Stewart and McKellen's makeup. I realize now it's how the scene progresses. It feels as if the film is pushing through the introduction just to get it out of the way, rather than using it to set a tone. Honestly, the whole film passes by relatively quickly. I remember being 30 minutes in and feeling like I had only watched about 15. Because every scene begins and ends at a snap of your fingers. I guess X3 just doesn't need build-up. For an apex storyline built up by the events of the previous two entries, X3 only has a runtime of about 104 minutes. Considering the first two films took the time to tell a good story, and the fact that the Phoenix was built up from the second film, you would think X3 would be more like an epic, would be far more tragic, the stakes never being higher. The damn Danger Room session should have been the movie. It's thankful that the film goes by so quickly because most of it feels dull. There isn't any notable padding, but the stakes just don't seem there. Yes, the mutant cure and Dark Phoenix are a big deal, but the narrative progresses with the attitude that it's just another day for the X-Men. I narrow it down to Ratner's direction, which always seems just plain lifeless. It worked for Red Dragon, but definitely doesn't work here.
Now, about Dark Phoenix. I can't put enough quotation marks around that.
In the comics, the Phoenix Force is a cosmic entity that uses Jean Grey as a host. In the Dark Phoenix saga from both the comics and the animated series, Phoenix takes a liking to the sensations of emotions she gets from Jean, and remains in her body to act out as she pleases. She's fiery, full of joyful rage and destruction, and fiery, not a zombie. I find it hilarious that Ratner's excuse on the DVD commentary is that it's Dark Phoenix, therefore this design totally makes sense.
Generally speaking, I'm not too picky about how costumes get translated to film. Like, the X-Men's leather outfits never really bothered me because I think if they actually wore their spandex, it'd look ridiculous.
You actually go outside in these things? What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
With Dark Phoenix, there's a bit of a jump from Jean Grey with fire, which they did just fine at the end of X2, to a 30 Days of Night reject.
And you think it stops with Jean? Nope.
Cyclops is killed, and Xavier is killed, and Cyclops is killed, even though she was never a villain, and now she's a scrawny henchman instead of the beautiful model she was in the comics. Storm is brash, loud, and indicts all of those around her, even though she's a teacher and a queen and would be sympathetic. And she doesn't die.
Let's see, what else?
I don't answer to my slave name.
Oh yeah, that.
My family tried to kill me, you pathetic meat sack.
I would much rather be watching that.
Mystique here is downright sadistic.
When I get out of here, I'm gonna kill you myself.
In the first two films, she, while deadly, was very calculative and reserved. You wouldn't expect her to spout out such cringe-worthy lines.
Homo sapien.
Even after Mystique X over here escapes, she's immediately cured and tossed out of the villain cast for no reason other than to try and raise the stakes as well as make way for the very uninteresting new villains.
I wish I could like this movie. I do. I really, really do. I mean, the first time I watched it, I did like it. But then it began to sink in. So many questions.
Why didn't the president just send Sentinels after Magneto, considering they're unaffected by his power? They might have helped against his army of rebellious mutants as well. Why did Juggernaut knock himself out when he hit Leech's wall? Why wouldn't he just go through the wall like he did all the others? Considering his helmet is there to protect his head so he can continue his momentum.
Keeps my face pretty.
Why does Dark Phoenix take until the climax of the film to become even slightly fiery looking? Why was the Danger Room so damn small? There's barely any room for combat in there. It's the Danger Room kiddie pool. Why does Storm never shut the fuck up? Why doesn't Beast quote literature?
As Churchill said, there comes a time when all men must... Oh, you get the point!
Where the hell is Nightcrawler? Why did hiring Brett Ratner seem like a good idea? Alright, now let's talk about the ending. Magneto gets cured, Jean gets pissed, Wolverine kills her. I love you. Rogue's back, Magneto sits alone playing chess by himself like that old man in that Pixar short, and he slightly moves a chess piece, making the entire narrative of this film relatively pointless. Integrity, to hell with that, we need sequel bait. Considering X-Men and X-Men 2 were such invigorating iterations of iconic characters, minus the few missteps, it's sad that Bryan Singer's decision to leave led to the failure of 2 comic book adaptations.
Bottom line, X-Men 3, for all its grandeur and intensity, remains a dull, lifeless, preachy, underwhelming installment to an otherwise flawed but entertaining franchise. I'm glad X-Men First Class made up for this. I'm neither for nor against an X-Men 4. I honestly don't care either way. I'm glad that First Class is going to be its own trilogy first. But apparently, according to Fox, X-Men The Last Stand apparently isn't going to be the last stand, so what are you gonna do?